Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know we have. It's been a delight to have all the family and everyone at our house. I think we had something close to 27 or 30 people at our house, and it's a little bit stressful when that many people are cooped up into one little house, but it's so much fun. And you know, I was reminding myself this morning that love is patient. You know, when you have around a lot of your family and friends, and they're invading your house, and but man, it's so worth it when you're sitting around having some of the great times, playing games and eating some great food and enjoying one another. I'm so grateful for that day and what Mark said about the day of Thanksgiving. It is one of the finest times of the year for us and for God's people to be able to get together and truly give God thanks for the great blessings we have in our country. It is a remarkable country we live in, and we have a great many freedoms we take for granted every day. I know we do. I do. We have nothing to compare with unless you've actually lived in some of the other nations, or at least researched and studied and see how other people in the nations live around the world. And that's hard to even contemplate unless you've experienced it. You know, and I've talked to several people who have lived in other nations, who have come here to the United States, and tell me that we should kiss the ground in America for all the great blessings and the freedoms that we enjoy here. We really do take them for granted, and we don't realize the wealth and the prosperity and the bounty that we have here in the United States. Speaking of trials, did Jesus receive a fair trial? I'd like to read from you a little bit from this book here. I've had this book for many years here. It's called The Illegal Trial of Jesus. I've commented on it in times past. I read it a couple of times. I even did a sermon one time before the feast down in Panama City, but I don't think I've ever done one here, and I would like to get this one on tape because it is such a remarkable book, and maybe if you get a chance to pick it up. It's called The Illegal Trial of Jesus. It's by Earl Wingo. I completely give him the credit for the material in this sermon, and I will be referring to his book and quoting from it very heavily throughout the sermon. As it regards the legal aspects of this horrible event that took place, the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the gospel accounts, we find the account of the trial in which Jesus underwent. After reviewing all the proceedings, this gentleman, Earl Wingo, he stated, and this is his quote, "I can say without reservation that except for the trials of Jesus, there has never been, nor shall there ever be in the annals of criminal jurisprudence, a more tragic and deliberate disregard for the existing laws and rules of equitable procedure." Now, that was written in 1954. I don't know if he would make that same statement today if he were alive today. Maybe he would. My question is, who was to blame for this great tragedy? Who was responsible for the utter disregard for the existing laws and procedures of an innocent man? Jesus was subject to two different trials, basically. First was of the Jews, when the Jews came and accused him of blasphemy, which was brought before the Sanhedrin. And the second was the later charge of sedition, which was brought before Pilate. Of course, Pilate was a Roman soldier, a Roman governor. The Jews would also use Pilate to approve their condemnation and sentence of death, by the way, which was outlawed for the Jews to even sentence someone to death. They had no authority to do that. But the final act was the Romans, who carried out the brutal crucifixion. Who held the greater responsibility? I mean, when you think about it, who was ultimately responsible for the death of Jesus? Was it the Romans? Was it Pilate? You know, there was one occasion when Jesus was before Pilate, and Pilate reminded him, "You know, I have the power to crucify you." And Jesus stated, "He that delivered me unto you has the greater sin." And of course, Jesus was referring to the high priest, Caiaphas, who had brought about this sentence. Jesus was a person who always told the truth, even though it wasn't popular. He lived the truth, He spoke the truth, even when it wasn't popular, as I said, and Jesus never made a mistake. He never sinned. Jesus lived a perfect life without sin. He never did any wrong or wronged anyone. The Jewish leaders, on the other hand, repeatedly sought to entrap him, humiliate him, or embarrass him, and ultimately succeeded in destroying him. For one, they misunderstood the teachings and the purpose of Jesus' ministry. Their hearts were cold and their heads were hard, and Jesus never in his life turned a deaf ear to someone who needed comforting and healing. He was a companion to sinners and publicans, as they even accused him of. You associate with sinners and publicans. He associated with a Samaritan woman who were the off scouring of the nations there in the land of Palestine. He was gentle and patient and kind. He was ready to listen and to heal, and his heart was always ready to forgive. This same man was spat upon, was ridiculed. He was slapped, scourged, crowned with a wreath of thorns, and brutally nailed to a Roman stake to die alone. And in the midst of this scene, we find Jesus' truest character exhibited when he cries out to his Father, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." After all of the things that they did to Jesus, we find him willing to forgive those that brought about this cruel death by asking his own Father to forgive them. In 67 AD, all of Judea became a Roman province. Judea was allowed a certain amount of semi-independence upon the death of Herod the Great, if you remember him from the earliest times in the Bible. The region was divided into 3 tetrarchies, over which a tetrarch ruled, and that was those 3 regions there. These later became known as procurators, as you'll see in the Bible. And Judea was subject to the whims and caprices of Rome. Of course, they all, even these governors, as they were later called, were to answer to Rome. Rome ultimately had the ultimate authority. The Caesar there was Tiberius Caesar. He was the Roman emperor. And Pilate was the procurator or governor of Judea, where Jesus lived. But it was Caesar who ultimately had the authority over Judea. And a lot of these guys were very afraid to make some decisions because of what the repercussions might get back to Rome. And some of them actually were recalled back to Rome. And I believe Pilate was on one occasion, and Herod was, because Rome would find out something that was going on that they didn't like, and they would recall them back, and they would have to answer. And it was a terrifying event to go back to Rome. You could lose your head for a certain set of circumstances. The Jews had, as I said, some autonomy. On the one hand, they had the highest position in their government was the high priest. We know that from reading the gospel accounts. He was the presiding judge in the Jewish court. The Sanhedrin was a 71-member body that was presided over by the high priest, and of course Caiaphas was, this year when Jesus was on trial, was the high priest during his last days on the earth. It was before Caiaphas whom Jesus, where he was tried, I should say. 2 major and principal religious groups existed, and we've talked about these. First was the Sadducees, who were under the domination of Annas. If you go back and read those accounts, you don't zero in specifically on Annas. Annas was previously one of the high priests there in Jerusalem. He had been replaced. Of course, he and his sons had held the position of high priest for, I believe, something like 51 years. And of course, he had become elderly and I guess became dysfunctional in that office, and he was put out. But he was a Sadducee, and he had a lot of political clout among the Sadducees, who held about 90% of the seats in the Sanhedrin. So you have the Pharisees on one hand, and you have the Sadducees on the other. And by the way, Annas' son-in-law, after he was replaced, he put his son-in-law Caiaphas in place of the high priest office. So he had tentacles throughout the Sanhedrin and the high priest office itself. So he had a lot of political clout and was able to sway the votes within that body called the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection or the rewards and punishment after, in the afterlife. It's important, I believe, to note that all of Jesus' teachings ran counter to the beliefs of the Sadducees. It's important to note that, because that will come up later in the events of Jesus and surrounding the trial of Jesus. Secondly, were the Pharisees, and we've had sermon after sermon about this. My point here is not to get into the specifics of the Pharisees. They were an arrogant and hypocritical group where tradition and customs were everything to them. You can read through the indictments that Jesus had against the Pharisees to get to the really meat of that. Jesus addressed both of these groups on several occasions, but the Pharisees were primary in his attack on appearing religious, but underneath, he called them dead men's bones, and the attack that he had on them, and the indictment he had against them. As I said, 90% of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees. So there existed between these two groups jealousies, suspicions, and of course the predominance for more power, and especially in the eyes of the Roman government. There were, however, among both groups, this underlying hatred for the Romans themselves. Because remember now, they're under the heels of Roman domination, and they still dreamed of someday becoming a nation once again, just like it was in the days of King David. In Romans, the first chapter, Paul would describe, I guess Paul could have been using these words to describe some of these Jews that he encountered with their tarnished attitude and their compromised character. He said they're filled with all uncleanness, unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy and murder and debate, deceitful, malignant, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, evil, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parent, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable. And the list goes on and on and on. But in the end of that list there, he said, who knowing the judgment of God. So he's not talking about total pagans out here. He's talking about religious people who know that God condemns these types of activities. He goes on to say that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in doing them. That was Paul's addressing these Gentiles and describing religious people who had turned their back on God and let their own human nature take charge. The Jews also were in search of the Messiah. You've got to remember that too. That is the underlying theme of the Jewish nation. They were in search and looking for the Messiah. They were looking for the king to restore the kingdom of Israel, as I said, just like it was under the leadership of King David. They wanted to be restored to positions of power and authority, and also the prosperity that they had under King David. They wanted to reestablish an earthly kingdom. They had lost their pride as a nation under the captivity of Rome. You can only imagine, what if today in the United States some nation invaded us, overtook our government, and now we're saluting some German flag? How would you feel? You would want to dream about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. You would want to be able to raise your own flag once again, and you would want to go back to the way things were. They had longed for and sought for this Messiah to come and deliver them from physical captivity. They were therefore disappointed when this healer of men wouldn't, with wild enthusiasm, lead them in a revolt against the Romans. They wanted him to lead a revolt, the Roman authorities, and perhaps overthrow the suppressive government. What greater acclamation would they have had to be able to proclaim that the Messiah was here, and he was the one that could heal their land and heal their people and heal their lives and even raise the dead? Think about it. They wanted to pick him up on their shoulders and take him into Jerusalem and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. On one occasion, they laid palms down on the road. You remember that? They wouldn't even let the donkey's foot touch the ground as they took their own garments off and threw them on the ground. And some people cut palm fronds and branches as he was being escorted into what has been known as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, when he said, they were crying out, "Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that comes in the name of the Lord." Notice the terminology that they used. For it has been written on another occasion, they said, "Fear not." Jesus actually said that, "Fear not, daughters of Zion. Behold, your king comes riding on an ass's colt." Why, he was the fulfillment of the actual prophecies of the Old Testament. Here he was riding in there on a colt. Peter even tried to incite the revolution on the betrayal of Jesus when he drew the sword and tried to cut off Malchus's ear. Remember that? Peter said, "I'll start it. If he won't, I will." And Jesus said, "Put up your sword, Peter." And of course, humiliated Peter. In Acts, the 1st chapter, his own disciples asked him, after he had been resurrected, "Will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" They knew and wanted this restoration. And when Jesus didn't make the move to restore the kingdom, there was universal disappointment and misunderstanding of Jesus' purpose. Jesus said on one occasion, "My kingdom is not of this world," and he even told Pilate, "If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight." Remember that when he said that to Pilate? My kingdom is not from thence. But this disappointment led to rejection, and they failed to understand the logic and the truth, and above all, the reason for his ministry and his message. Their carnal minds were still centered around a physical kingdom. And so they were bewildered, disappointed, and lost their faith in him. And believe it or not, they even began to hate him and despise him and reject even the miracles that he had performed in his sight. Their hatred trumped the miracles that he did because they wanted someone to be their king, their physical king. I wanted today, in this book, the point of this book was to look at some of the characters that were involved. I mentioned some of them in these opening comments here. I'm going to quickly go through these. I'd like to go through all of them. I don't have time in a sermon to do that, but maybe we get through as many as we can here. I'd just like to make a little paragraph comment about each of these individuals. Maybe in the end here you can decide who was ultimately responsible for the illegal trial, the arrest, the trial, the sentencing, and the death of Jesus Christ. I'd like to start at the very top, and I'd like to start at the most obvious one first, and we've done several sermons on him, and that's Judas Iscariot. I'm not going to belabor it, the fact about him. We know his responsibility in the betrayal of Jesus. All I can say is, here was a man who betrayed his friend for 30 pieces of silver. You know, on looking at this evidence, I realized something occurred to me. You know, Judas was very smart. And you know why I say that? Because he was one of the very first ones to figure it out that Jesus wasn't going to establish his kingdom here. The rest of them thought to the very end, and even after Jesus' death, that he was going to establish his kingdom right here and right now. It was Judas who figured this out very quickly, and he therefore had his hopes dashed. I believe Judas may have wanted some revenge upon the other people in his circle. And so he had his hopes and dreams dashed. He thought he was going to be in charge of maybe all of the money in Jerusalem. We know that he was a thief and he held the bag, as Jesus called him. He began to look at Jesus as a failure and maybe even somewhat of a pauper. And he had no real authority when it came to the Roman government. That's the way Judas began to see Jesus. And he decided to get what he could from Jesus while there was a chance. And of course, he betrayed him. He participated in the cowardly arrest at night when Jesus said, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "I am." And they all fell away backwards. I love that scene. I like to really really take in that scene when his powerful voice caused them all to stumble and fall away backwards in the night dust there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then they sort of had to pick themselves up off the ground, and eventually he walks up and gives him the infamous kiss of death, a betrayal of a close friend. I guess the slimy coward went out and hung himself and didn't even see the fulfillment of his dirty deed. That's really all I have to say about Judas Iscariot. I'd like to start, as I said at the top, with Tiberius Caesar. He played no direct role, really, in the illegal trial of Jesus, other than the fact he appointed Pontius Pilate to be the governor over the land of Judea. Any Roman citizen was allowed to appeal to Caesar, as did the Apostle Paul. You remember the Apostle Paul says, "I appeal to Caesar," because he was a Roman citizen. He could do that. Jesus was not a Roman citizen, so he wasn't given that opportunity. But I don't believe that he would have been allowed to appeal to Caesar's, given the fact of the evidence of the trial as we see it now, as it's recorded. Tiberius was only responsible in that he could have removed Pilate from office there as governor over Judea, and he probably should have, but he didn't. I'd like to go now to Herod the Tetrarch. Not much is mentioned about Herod. You remember Jesus during his trial went to Pilate, and then he went before Herod, and there was an exchange there. Before Jesus, as I said, was brought before Herod. But Herod before then was known as a drunkard. Some of the Jewish writings record that he perhaps consumed up to a gallon of wine a day. He was without conscience. He was noted for his cruelty. Remember, Herod's father married 10 different women, and he had 7 of them murdered because he got tired of them. This Herod, who was Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee, was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. You remember how John, on one occasion, dared to expose the unholy marriage of Salome's mother to his brother's wife. You remember John said, "She's not lawful to be your wife," and that so infuriated him that they had this plot and plan together at this big banquet to remember she danced, Salome danced, and this Herod said, "I'll give you up to half the kingdom. What do you ask for?" And his mother convinced her to ask for the head of John the Baptist. That's the kind of man we're dealing with here. It is interesting to me that Jesus was once warned to not stay in Galilee, to leave Galilee, because Herod could sentence you to death. And Jesus, his words back to Herod, now this is pretty powerful. "You go tell that fox, behold, I cast out devils, and I do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected." That's pretty strong stuff to say back to someone like that, wouldn't you say? During his appeal, or during his appearance, as I should say, during his trial, when he went before Herod couldn't wait to see Jesus. He wanted to meet him. He wanted to see some fantastic miracle be performed right in front of him. Jesus answered him not a word. I don't know how to take that. I really don't. I thought and studied about that scene. Here's a man who's claiming all of this pomp and authority, and Jesus wouldn't even give him an answer. I don't know if Jesus was rebuking him by his own silence or what, but he would not answer the man. That was powerful. I mean, to me, that's powerful stuff. You're in front of a dignitary, someone who only answers to Rome. And he wouldn't even answer the guy. That came to surface when you examine these characters here in this story. I'd like to move on now to Pontius Pilate. This fellow here is a little more well-known, I guess, because he's mentioned so many times in this account. He was a man of extreme violence and one who feared of being reported to the emperor. He had authority to stop this senseless trial, but he didn't do it. On 2 occasions, Jesus was brought before Pilate on 2 occasions, and 4 times Pilate said, I find no guilt in this man. Listen to what happened to him. Listen to Pilate's last days there with Jesus. He said, I find no fault in a man, and as a result of his backbone, or lack of backbone, I should say, and willingness to appease the Jewish leaders, when the most important moment arrived for him to do something, he caved. He vacillated to the crowds. He tried to please the Jews. He simply, you remember, he stood up there, took a basin, and washed his hands and said, I am innocent of the blood of this just man. He knew he was innocent. So did his wife, who told him, have nothing to do with this man. I tell you that many things have happened to me this day because of this just man. The dreams that I've had today don't have anything to do with him. And so like a coward too, he vacillated to the influence of the crowd and to the Jews and to the Sanhedrin. And he just simply had this act as if washing his hands was going to absolve him of any responsibility or guilt as a result of this illegal trial. The next is Annas, as I mentioned earlier, who was behind the scenes in the Sanhedrin. Everything Jesus taught discredited Annas. Annas had the motivation for destroying Jesus, and I'll tell you why. He was a Sadducee, as I mentioned. He controlled the exchange of sacrifices in the temple. So he was responsible for all of these sacrifices being sold. And so they made a little money off of all the people that came into the temple. The temple wasn't a holy place to him. It was just a place for people to assemble. Big crowd like a mall. That's where I can set up a booth and make some money. He held sway over the Sanhedrin. And of course, the bankers profited as a result of the exchange of monies. Every time they would take the foreign money of all the 19 different dialects who were there on the day of Pentecost, exchange money for the sacrifices. Each one of them took a little bit of off the top in order to exchange their money from Greece to the money that they were using there in Jerusalem. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. That's diametrically opposite of what the Sadducees believe. You talk about hitting them head on. They didn't believe in the resurrection. And here's a man that raised somebody from the dead. He had to be stopped, or else everyone would begin to follow him. And they even said that on one occasion. They're going to be swept away. They're all going to follow him. Jesus overturned the money changers again, which was a direct challenge to this aged politician who had conspired, now remember, with Caiaphas and who was his son-in-law, the high priest, and with Judas for 30 pieces of silver to destroy Jesus. It was no accident. If you go back and read the account, you find out that as soon as Jesus was arrested, who was he carried before? He wasn't carried before the high priest. He was taken before Annas. I don't think that's an accident. You know why? Because I'm going to read to you here in a little bit here the responsibility of the Sanhedrin. He was able to put together a group at night, a small group of these Sanhedrin, and believe it or not, there were some of those Sanhedrin that weren't there. A lot of them weren't there that night. And at night, they were trying to put together this little trial and to bring about a quick and speedy decision of the death penalty for Jesus. He secretly arranged with his son-in-law to call a nighttime quorum of 23 members. That's all they required to have a quorum in the Sanhedrin. And then proceeded to conduct a trial which had the death penalty. During the Passover season, there was a Jewish law of the Sanhedrin that said they could not meet at night and they could not during the Passover. And both of those he broke in order to conduct this illegal trial, while everyone was observing the Passover and most of them were sound asleep. You know which Sanhedrin he didn't invite? Do we know any Sanhedrin that went to Jesus by night and said, "We know that you're the Son of God"? You remember? We know Joseph of Arimathea was one of them, helped take the body of Jesus down, remember? There were Sanhedrin that believed in Jesus, but they were afraid of the crowd. The next person I'd like to look at is Caiaphas himself. He was the high priest. He presided over the court of the Sanhedrin. He was supposed to show impartiality toward the accused at all times. You think that happened to Jesus? Instead, he was being controlled by his father-in-law, Annas. He went about to seek false witnesses. Now, how would you like to have a judge over a trial that you were in for, and you got falsely accused of murder, and you found out the judge had went out to get false witnesses against you? Think about it. And he personally brought about the charge of blasphemy, which is unheard of in a court hearing. The prosecutor is the one that brings in the charges. And they bring witnesses, not the judge. The judge doesn't say, "I'm going to frame him for blasphemy." Think about it in light of the courts that you may have witnessed or been involved with. He would later state, "What further need of witnesses do we have?" What a judge, man. They're supposed to bring witnesses to prove wrong and right. They were supposed to have 2 or 3 witnesses to establish, anything that was, any blame that was on somebody, and to substantiate the facts. He was allowed Jesus to be buffeted, slapped, spit in his face, disregarded the existing laws, and he personally led him to Pilate. The judge got down off of his stand, walked around and grabbed Jesus and went to Pilate with him. He wanted this to happen in a hurry and at night. As I said, in hopes of a speedy verdict. He continued to serve even though he had enmity against Jesus. Remember that, because I'm going to state something here in just a moment. He winked at justice. He ignored the law. And there was to be no trial at night, and they sought the death penalty that was outlawed by the Roman government. As I said, the Roman government allowed them to have these little puppet trials and assume the responsibility of semi-independence, but they could not sentence someone to death. The Roman government had to do that, and he was the loudest voice of the crowd that wanted to release Barabbas during the time of the year when they would release a prisoner. The Sanhedrin, that brings me to this body called the Sanhedrin. They were the court of the Jewish people. The Jewish people of that land, they didn't go to the Roman courts. They went to the Sanhedrin, who were a religious body that were over the people. This was established back in the days of Moses. Remember, on one occasion I quoted to you, there was a time when Moses said, "God, kill me. I've had enough. I can't bear these people, not another minute. I'm not like a nursing father. I can't just take care of these kids like a nursing mother or like a father over these children. They want meat. How am I going to give them meat? Just go ahead and kill me." And God said, "That's it, Moses. That's enough. Gather among you 70 men who are leaders in your community, in their communities, that are upstanding citizens, and let them judge the people." And so he did. He let them do that. And of course, 70 plus Moses was the one that presided over the 70, so there was 71. That lasted even up through the time of Jesus' day, when the 71 members of the Sanhedrin were supposed to be present here at the trial of Jesus. Each man was to possess the following qualities. I'd like to read from this book here just a little bit here. These are the qualities the Sanhedrin are supposed to have. He must be a Hebrew and a lineal descent from Hebrew parents. He must be learned in Hebrew law, both written and unwritten. He must be familiar with the languages of the surrounding nations. He must have been modest, popular, good appearance, and free of haughtiness. He must have been pious, strong, and courageous. So we're talking about upstanding, prince-like qualities among these men. No man was qualified to sit as judge who was concerned or interested in the matter to be adjudicated. So if you knew something about the event, or you hated the guy, then you were to step down and remove yourself. He must take an oath to be fair and not to serve where there exists enmity between him and any prisoner brought before him in the court of trial. Again, it's the same comment. There was provision to effect a 23-member quorum of the great Sanhedrin. Now, I forgot to mention to you, there was the minor Sanhedrin, there was the major Sanhedrin, and then the great Sanhedrin. I guess maybe like the county court and the state court and the Supreme Court of our land today. Wonder where we got that idea from. He says, under the Mishnah, a very unusual provision existed where if a unanimous vote occurred upon the death penalty, where all 71 said he's guilty, the guy walked free. That's sort of unusual. This is out of the Jewish writings, out of the Mishnah. But I guess that was to keep somebody from being railroaded by the whole group. If it was unanimous, the guy was actually let free. The Hebrew law in both Talmudic and Mosaic provided that at least 2 witnesses were required to convict the accused person. And I believe that's why they tried to get 2 witnesses to agree with their story, and they couldn't even get those witnesses to agree. The Hebrew law did not permit a conviction to be based on a confession alone. There must be supporting evidence in addition to such confession. So they were to bring in witnesses, they were to bring in evidence and to submit it like we have in a court of law today. I won't read all of this. I mentioned that they weren't allowed to give the death penalty. Jesus also did not have a lawyer like you might have today, a defense lawyer. He was standing there by himself with the judge and the jury and everybody in place. And as I said, they weren't to try anyone at nighttime or on a Friday or on the Feast of Passover. Of course, it was the preparation day, which was the day before the Sabbath day or during the time of the Passover. Joseph of Arimathea, as I mentioned, was one of those Sanhedrin, and the other one was Nicodemus. I gave you a little time to think about that, who that was, who the other one was that came to Jesus by night. I won't go into, I wanted to spend a lot of time on the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus, we've had sermons after sermon about them. Their responsibility of this trial was well documented. Many sermons have been given to declaring the unrighteousness of these 2 parties. Jesus told them to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. I think that statement had a lot bigger impact than what they took from it. You know, he was talking about the money and the taxes, but I believe he meant it broad strokes with your whole life. You serve Caesar as you see fit to Caesar, but unto God, he is the principal. He's the one that you commit to him the things that are God's. And they rejected every bit of that idea. Jesus called them a generation of vipers, robbers of widows' homes, blind leaders of the blind, who strained at a gnat and swallowed a camel. And that certainly took place during his trial. Who lay heavy burdens on men's back, grievous to be borne. They loved to have long prayers and wear loud garments and be called rabbi. And Jesus called them whitened sepulchres full of dead men's bones. Their responsibility to readily cooperate with other enemies of Jesus, to me, is certainly striking indeed. One of the saddest scriptures in all the Bible in light of this subject is in John, the 1st chapter, where he says, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. That's sad to me. His own countrymen, his own nation completely rejected him. The final group I'd like to look at, and thank you for bearing with me. I'd like to have gone through all of these. Maybe someday I'll do the rest of them. The final group I'd like to look at is the cruel mob. It was on this occasion, on one occasion that I mentioned earlier, when Jesus had his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. As I said, they were taking their garments off and taking palm fronds and branches and throwing them on the ground. And they began to cry with enthusiasm, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." These same people, only a few days earlier, had spoken these words. In these same streets, in the same city, with the same voices, began to cry, "Away with him! Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" You see, the leaders, Annas and Caiaphas and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, had incited the people and stirred up this hatred for a man that they once loved. Now they wanted to brutally murder him. There was an enmity against the Lamb of God that didn't exist only days before. And they turned their backs on the one who had healed them, fed them, preserved them, blessed them, and forgave them. I'd like to conclude here with page 142 in this book. There has now been unfolded in this review the tragic drama of what may be properly denominated as a judicial murder of the Son of God. He was not given the remotest semblance of a legal trial. The entire proceedings were born of a cowardly conspiracy and nurtured in hate and spleen. The 18 errors assigned herein, and you can go through this book and he mentioned all of them, should certainly be sufficient evidence to convince any fair-minded individual seeking the truth that on that miserable, memorable day in 31 AD, when the Master was subjected to the whims of a brutal cowards, justice was indeed asleep while wrong ruled the land. That was the illegal trial of Jesus Christ. And you have to decide who held the most responsibility.